For 2,000 years, European peasants survived famines by eating one plant that grows everywhere without cultivation, costs nothing, and requires zero maintenance. Then in less than 50 years, chemical companies reclassified it as a noxious weed, created herbicides to kill it, and convinced 3 generations of people that it would harm them if they touched it. The plant we are talking about is stinging nettle, scientifically known as Urtica dioica. And before you say you have heard of it, understand that what you know is probably fear-based propaganda designed to keep you away from one of the most nutritionally complete foods that exists in nature. You were taught that nettles are dangerous. You were told they sting and should be avoided. You learned to recognize them so you could stay away. That was not education, that was programming, and it was deliberate. Let me start with the nutritional facts because once you see these numbers, you will understand why this plant had to be suppressed. Stinging nettle leaves contain 25 to 42% protein by dry weight. That is higher than most beans, higher than lentils, and comparable to soybeans. But unlike soy, nettle protein is easily digestible and does not require industrial processing. You can eat nettle leaves cooked and get complete bioavailable protein without any intervention. That threatens the entire protein supplement industry. The iron content is extraordinary. Fresh nettle leaves contain 4 to 5 milligrams of iron per 100 grams. Dried nettle has even more, up to 41 milligrams per 100 grams. Compare that to beef, which has approximately 2.6 milligrams per 100 grams. Spinach has only 2.7 milligrams. Nettle has nearly double the iron of beef and spinach, and it grows wild without any inputs. If you are anemic, if you need iron, nettle could solve that problem in weeks. But you cannot buy it in grocery stores, and most people do not even know it is food. Calcium content is even more shocking. Nettle contains between 400 and 2,000 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams of dried leaves, depending on growing conditions. Milk has approximately 120 milligrams per 100 grams. That means nettle has 3 to 17 times more calcium than dairy. If you want strong bones, if you need calcium, nettle provides it in quantities that make dairy irrelevant. But the dairy industry does not want you knowing that a free weed outperforms their product. Vitamins are equally impressive. Nettle is loaded with vitamin A more than carrots. Vitamin C more than many citrus fruits. Vitamin K for blood clotting and bone health. B vitamins including folate. It is essentially a multivitamin growing wild. One serving of cooked nettle provides more micronutrients than most people get from an entire day of processed food. That is not hyperbole. That is biochemical reality. And it is free, growing everywhere. That is the problem. Now let me tell you the historical truth about nettle because this is where the suppression becomes obvious. Nettle has been eaten in Europe for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence shows nettle fibers in Bronze Age clothing. Medieval herbals describe it as food and medicine. During both world wars, when supply lines collapsed, governments issued nettle as emergency rations. British citizens were encouraged to harvest it to supplement wartime diets. Nettle soup, nettle tea, nettle greens were standard wartime nutrition because nettle was reliable, abundant, and required no agricultural inputs when everything else was scarce. After the war, nettle consumption continued in rural areas. People who lived through famine knew the value. But then something changed. As industrial agriculture expanded and chemical companies developed herbicides, nettle went from food to weed, not because it stopped being nutritious, because it could not be controlled, patented, or sold repeatedly, and that made it a threat. Let me break down the mechanisms of suppression, because this was not accidental. First, reclassification. Agricultural agencies and chemical companies listed nettle as a noxious weed, not because it harms anything, but because calling it noxious created justification for herbicide sales. Second, fear-based marketing. Chemical companies emphasized the sting and created danger narratives. Educational materials taught children to avoid nettle, not harvest it. Within one generation, knowledge was replaced with fear. Third, displacement of wild food culture. As supermarkets became dominant, foraging was stigmatized as poverty behavior. Fourth, removal from seed catalogs. By the 1980s, nettle had disappeared from gardening books and agricultural education. Fifth, regulatory pressure. Growing plants classified as noxious can result in fines. Homeowner associations ban it. Social and legal pressure discourages cultivation without outright prohibition. The result of these mechanisms is complete knowledge erasure. Today, most people in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe have never eaten nettle. They do not know it is edible, they fear it, they spray it, and when systems collapse, when supply chains fail, they will starve surrounded by free protein and minerals they do not recognize. That is not accidental. That is the result of systematic suppression designed to maintain dependence on industrial food systems. From a prepper and survival perspective, nettle is invaluable. It grows in temperate climates across North America, Europe, and Asia. It thrives in disturbed soil, along rivers and streams, in forests, and even in urban vacant lots. It is perennial, meaning it comes back every year without replanting or maintenance. In spring, nettle is one of the first greens available when gardens have not yet produced anything. A single established patch of nettle can provide continuous harvests for months during growing season. And because it is so nutrient dense, a small amount provides substantial, complete nutrition. This is survival food that costs nothing and requires no infrastructure. Let me explain how to identify nettle, because knowledge is the first step to independence. Stinging nettle grows as an upright plant, typically 2 to 6 feet tall, depending on soil conditions and sunlight. The stems are square in cross-section, which is unusual and helps with identification. They are covered with hollow stinging hairs that contain the chemicals responsible for the sting. The leaves are opposite, meaning they grow in pairs along the stem. They are heart-shaped with deeply serrated edges, and both surfaces are covered with stinging hairs. The sting comes from these hollow hairs, which inject histamine, formic acid, and other irritating chemicals when broken by contact. It is painful, but not dangerous. The sting causes a burning sensation that fades within a few hours and causes no lasting harm. The plant produces small greenish flowers in drooping clusters from the leaf axils during summer months. The key identifying features are the square stem, opposite serrated leaves, and most importantly, the sting itself. If you touch nettle with bare skin, you will know immediately. That is actually the most reliable identification method available. The sting is unmistakable and cannot be confused with anything else. There are a few nettle lookalikes, including dead nettle and false nettle, but none of them produce a sting. If it stings, it is nettle. If it does not sting, it is something else. That makes nettle one of the easiest plants to identify once you overcome the initial fear of touching it. Harvesting nettle requires gloves or careful technique to avoid the sting. In early spring, when plants are 6 to 12 inches tall, the leaves are most tender and have the mildest flavor. You can cut the top 4 to 6 inches of the plant with scissors or pruning shears. Later in the season, you can harvest just the top few leaf sets. Wear thick gloves or fold leaves in half along the midrib and grasp through the fold to avoid direct contact with stinging hairs. Once nettle is cooked, blanched, or dried, the stinging hairs are completely neutralized and the plant is safe to handle and eat with bare hands. The sting is a mechanical defense mechanism, not a chemical toxin. Heat or drying destroys the structure of the stinging hairs. Preparation is simple. Nettle can be used like spinach. Blanch it in boiling water for 30 seconds to neutralize the sting, then drain. Sauté nettle with garlic and oil. Add it to soups, stews, and pasta. Blend it into pesto. Use it in omelets or quiches. Nettle soup is traditional, made by simmering nettle with potatoes and onions, then blending smooth. Nettle tea is made by steeping leaves in hot water. The flavor is mild and earthy. Nettle can also be dried for long-term storage. Hang bundles in a dry, dark place until leaves are brittle. Then strip leaves from stems and store in jars. Dried nettle retains most of its nutritional value and can be used in teas, soups, or ground into powder for smoothies. This is how you create food security. Harvest abundant wild nettle in spring, dry it, and you have high protein, mineral-rich food that lasts for years without refrigeration or canning. From a seed-saving perspective, nettle does not require human intervention to perpetuate itself. It is perennial and spreads through underground rhizomes that extend outward each year. Once established in a location, a nettle patch persists indefinitely without any human maintenance or replanting. You can also actively propagate nettle by dividing roots in early spring or fall seasons. This means you can establish nettle on your property and have a permanent, expanding source of complete nutrition. But this is exactly what the system does not want. A plant that multiplies itself, spreads freely, and provides complete nutrition makes you independent from their products. Let me address the legal and regulatory situation because this is important. In most places, nettle is not specifically prohibited. However, in some jurisdictions, it is classified as a noxious weed, which can create legal barriers to intentional cultivation. In practice, nettle grows wild almost everywhere, and harvesting wild nettle for personal use is generally legal. The restrictions typically target cultivation, not foraging from wild populations. This creates a situation where you can legally harvest nettle from wild areas, roadside ditches, and public lands, but growing it deliberately in your garden might technically violate local weed ordinances or homeowner association rules. Enforcement is inconsistent and rarely targets individuals for personal use, but the laws exist to create uncertainty and discourage widespread adoption. There is also significant social pressure to consider. If you grow nettle visibly in your yard, neighbors may complain that you are allowing weeds to proliferate. Homeowner associations may demand removal citing aesthetic standards or weed control policies. The cultural programming against nettle is strong enough that even where cultivation is technically legal, social conflict can arise. This is why knowledge needs to spread quietly, person to person, through communities that value food independence over social conformity and appearance standards. Here is what needs to happen to reverse this suppression. First, education. People need to learn that nettle is food, not danger. Second, cultural change. The stigma around wild foods must be challenged. Third, community knowledge sharing. People who know nettle need to teach others. Fourth, legal reform. Classifications labeling nettle as noxious need to be challenged. Fifth, direct action. People need to grow, harvest, and eat nettle despite pressure. Some of this is happening. Foraging has grown in popularity among health-conscious people. Wild food advocates teach nettle identification. Herbalists promote nettle tea. Farmers markets in some areas sell fresh nettle in spring. Knowledge is reviving. Climate change is making food systems more fragile. Extreme weather disrupts harvests. Plants like nettle that require no inputs become increasingly valuable. But if people do not know it exists, its potential is wasted. Let me give you specific examples of how nettle could change food security. A family with access to a nettle patch could harvest enough greens in spring and early summer to provide daily servings of high-protein vegetables for months. Dried nettle could supplement winter diets when fresh produce is unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Nettle tea could replace expensive vitamin and mineral supplements entirely. For people on limited budgets, nettle represents free nutrition that significantly reduces food costs. For preppers, nettle is insurance against supply disruptions. For homesteaders, it is a low-maintenance perennial crop that produces without inputs. In a collapse scenario, nettle becomes even more critical. If you have rice and beans but no fresh vegetables, you develop vitamin deficiencies within months. But if you have nettle, you have vitamins and minerals that grow without you doing anything. A handful of cooked nettle daily prevents deficiency diseases and maintains health. The chemical companies that suppress nettle now face a problem. Nettle is becoming herbicide resistant. Just like amaranth, nettle populations are evolving resistance to glyphosate. The agricultural industry's response is predictable. Stronger herbicides, higher application rates, new chemical formulations. but they are not reconsidering whether these plants should be recognized as food instead of fought as enemies. That would threaten too many industries. Meanwhile, nettle continues growing everywhere. It is impossible to eradicate. The war on nettle is unwinnable. Here is what I predict will happen. As economic conditions worsen and food becomes more expensive, more people will rediscover nettle. They will learn what their great-grandparents knew. Underground networks of foragers will share knowledge. Nettle will spread in cultivation despite regulations because you cannot stop a perennial plant that propagates through roots. The suppression will fail because people will ignore laws out of necessity. Understanding nettle is understanding how food suppression works. It is not about banning plants outright. It is about reclassification, fear-based marketing, cultural stigma, removal from education, and regulatory barriers that discourage use. It is about creating a population that does not recognize free food growing everywhere around them. It is about dependence through systematic ignorance, and it works incredibly well. Most people have no idea that nettle exists as food. They fear a plant that could nourish them completely. They pay for supplements that nettle provides free. They accept malnutrition in the midst of natural abundance. That is the success of suppression. The story of nettle is the pattern repeated across dozens of plants that once fed humanity, but are now classified as weeds. Each represents knowledge deliberately erased. Each threatens industries built on scarcity. The system wants you dependent and desperate to keep buying what nature provides free. But plants like nettle keep growing despite suppression. Every person who learns to identify and eat nettle becomes one less customer. That is power. That is independence. That is what they fear. If this video opened your eyes to suppressed food knowledge, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this matters. Subscribe because we expose forgotten plants and banned crops every week. What is coming next could save your life when systems fail. Drop a comment. Tell me if nettle grows where you live. Tell me if you have harvested it. This is a community reclaiming stolen knowledge. Share this video with someone who needs to know. Knowledge is the only thing they cannot take away.